Question 1. Risk assessment procedures indicate that an e-commerce business operating in Alabama may be inadvertently collecting personal data from Alabama residents without explicit, informed consent for personalization purposes. Which of the following approaches best ensures regulatory compliance with Alabama e-commerce laws? Option A. Rely on the assumption that existing federal data privacy regulations adequately address the specific requirements for Alabama residents. Option B. Continue using the existing generic privacy policy, assuming it covers general data protection principles applicable to all users. Option C. Update the website's privacy policy and terms of service to clearly disclose data collection practices, including personalization, and implement an affirmative consent mechanism for Alabama residents before data collection begins. Option D. Implement a click-wrap agreement that is accessible via a link at the bottom of the homepage, requiring users to agree to terms before browsing. Correct answer is C. Update the website's privacy policy and terms of service to clearly disclose data collection practices, including personalization, and implement an affirmative consent mechanism for Alabama residents before data collection begins. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in e-commerce, particularly within Alabama's regulatory landscape, where businesses must navigate evolving consumer protection laws and data privacy requirements. The core difficulty lies in balancing the desire for efficient data collection to personalize user experiences with the legal obligations to inform and obtain consent from Alabama residents regarding the use of their personal information. Failure to do so can lead to significant legal repercussions, including fines and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance without unduly hindering business operations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively updating the website's privacy policy and terms of service to clearly disclose the types of data collected, the purposes for which it is used, including personalization, and the mechanisms for obtaining explicit consent from Alabama residents. This approach directly addresses the requirements of Alabama law by ensuring transparency and informed consent. Specifically, Alabama law, like many state-level e-commerce regulations, emphasizes the consumer's right to know how their data is handled and to control its usage. A clear, accessible, and easily understandable privacy policy, coupled with a mechanism for affirmative consent, e.g., a checkbox before data collection begins, demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical data handling. Incorrect approaches analysis. Relying solely on a generic, pre-existing privacy policy that does not specifically address Alabama's consumer protection statutes or data handling requirements is a significant regulatory failure. Such a policy may not adequately inform Alabama residents about their rights or the specific data practices of the e-commerce business, potentially violating disclosure requirements. Implementing a click-wrap agreement that is buried deep within the website or presented in a way that is not easily noticeable or understandable by Alabama consumers also constitutes a failure. While click-wrap agreements can be valid, their effectiveness hinges on clear presentation and the opportunity for the consumer to review the terms before agreeing. If the agreement is not readily apparent or its terms are ambiguous, it may not be considered valid consent under Alabama law, leaving the business exposed to noncompliance. Assuming that existing federal data privacy laws are sufficient to cover all aspects of data collection and use for Alabama residents is another incorrect approach. While federal laws provide a baseline, state-specific regulations often impose additional or more stringent requirements. Alabama may have specific consumer protection statutes or interpretations of data privacy that go beyond federal mandates, necessitating a tailored compliance strategy. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and jurisdiction-specific approach to regulatory compliance. This involves regularly reviewing and updating privacy policies and terms of service to align with the latest state and federal laws. A robust compliance framework should include mechanisms for obtaining explicit and informed consent, conducting regular audits of data collection and usage practices, and providing clear channels for consumer inquiries and requests. When in doubt, consulting with legal counsel specializing in e-commerce and data privacy law in Alabama is a critical step in ensuring adherence to all applicable regulations. Question: Risk assessment procedures indicate that an e-commerce business operating in Alabama may be inadvertently collecting personal data from Alabama residents without explicit, informed consent for personalization purposes. Which of the following approaches best ensures regulatory compliance with Alabama e-commerce laws? Options. A. Update the website's privacy policy and terms of service to clearly disclose data collection practices, including personalization, and implement an affirmative consent mechanism for Alabama residents before data collection begins. B. Continue using the existing generic privacy policy, assuming it covers general data protection principles applicable to all users. C. Implement a click-wrap agreement that is accessible via a link at the bottom of the home page, requiring users to agree to terms before browsing. D. Rely on the assumption that existing federal data privacy regulations adequately address the specific requirements for Alabama residents. Question 2. The audit findings indicate that an Alabama-based online retailer has been experiencing an increase in sales to customers in Canada and Mexico. The retailer's legal counsel has raised concerns about potential compliance issues related to these international transactions. Considering the principles of Alabama e-commerce law and the supremacy of federal law in implementing international agreements, which of the following approaches best addresses the retailer's potential compliance challenges? Option A. Assume that Alabama's existing e-commerce statutes are sufficient to govern all transactions, including those with international customers, as the business is physically located within Alabama. Option B. Rely on general principles of international trade law without investigating specific treaty obligations, believing that broad understanding is adequate for compliance. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of relevant international treaties and agreements to which the United States is a signatory that specifically address e-commerce, consumer protection, and data privacy, and assess their direct or indirect impact on the retailer's cross-border operations, in conjunction with Alabama's e-commerce statutes. Option D. Disregard any international legal considerations, focusing solely on Alabama state law, as the transactions are conducted online and do not involve physical movement of goods across borders in a traditional sense. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of relevant international treaties and agreements to which the United States is a signatory that specifically address e-commerce, consumer protection, and data privacy, and assess their direct or indirect impact on the retailer's cross-border operations, in conjunction with Alabama's e-commerce statutes. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential gap in understanding how international e-commerce transactions involving Alabama businesses are governed. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the intersection of state-level e-commerce regulations with the complexities of international law, specifically treaties and agreements that might supersede or complement Alabama's own statutory framework. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance and mitigate legal and financial risks. The best professional approach involves proactively identifying and assessing the applicability of relevant international treaties and agreements to the specific e-commerce activities of Alabama businesses. This includes understanding how these international instruments might impact aspects like contract formation, dispute resolution, consumer protection, and data privacy for cross-border transactions. By prioritizing this comprehensive review, businesses can ensure their practices align with both state and international legal obligations, thereby minimizing the risk of noncompliance and potential litigation. This approach is correct because Alabama law, while governing interstate commerce, does not operate in a vacuum. Federal law, which often implements international treaty obligations, and the treaties themselves, can directly or indirectly affect how Alabama businesses engage in international e-commerce. A thorough understanding of these international frameworks is essential for robust compliance. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on Alabama's existing e-commerce statutes, assuming they fully address all aspects of international transactions. This fails to acknowledge that international treaties, once ratified by the United States, can become the supreme law of the land, potentially overriding conflicting state laws. This oversight could lead to significant legal challenges and penalties. Another incorrect approach is to assume that general principles of international trade law are sufficient without specific examination of treaties directly relevant to e-commerce, such as those concerning electronic signature, consumer rights in online transactions, or cross-border data flows. This broad assumption lacks the specificity needed for accurate compliance and may overlook critical nuances within particular treaty provisions. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to ignore international considerations entirely, believing that Alabama law is the only relevant jurisdiction for businesses operating within its borders, regardless of the origin or destination of e-commerce transactions. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how international commerce operates and the binding nature of international agreements on U.S. businesses. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a tiered analysis. First, understanding the specific Alabama e-commerce laws applicable. Second, identifying any relevant federal laws that implement international obligations. And third, researching and evaluating the impact of applicable international treaties and agreements on the business's cross-border e-commerce activities. This systematic approach ensures comprehensive legal and regulatory coverage. Question 3. System analysis indicates that an e-commerce business based in Alabama is developing a new online service that requires customers to agree to terms and conditions electronically. The business wants to ensure that these electronic agreements are legally binding under both Alabama and national laws. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance and legal validity for these electronic agreements? Option A. Implement a system that relies on the interpretation of general contract law principles without specific reference to either the Alabama Electronic Commerce Act or the e-Sign Act. Option B. Conduct a detailed review of the Alabama Electronic Commerce Act and the Federal Electronic Signatures in Global and National Commerce Act, e-Sign Act, to identify any potential conflicts or areas where federal law preempts state law, and then implement practices that satisfy the requirements of both, prioritizing the more protective standard where they differ. Option C. Assume that the Alabama Electronic Commerce Act is sufficient for all electronic transactions conducted within the state and does not require further consideration of federal laws. Option D. Focus solely on the e-Sign Act, believing that its national scope automatically covers all electronic agreements originating from Alabama, rendering state-specific laws irrelevant. The correct answer is B. Conduct a detailed review of the Alabama Electronic Commerce Act and the Federal Electronic Signatures in Global and National Commerce Act, e-Sign Act, to identify any potential conflicts or areas where federal law preempts state law, and then implement practices that satisfy the requirements of both, prioritizing the more protective standard where they differ. Explanation. System analysis indicates that navigating the intersection of state-specific e-commerce laws and national regulations presents a significant professional challenge for businesses operating in Alabama. The complexity arises from the need to ensure compliance with both the Alabama Electronic Commerce Act and any applicable federal laws, which may have overlapping or even conflicting requirements. Careful judgment is required to identify which regulatory framework takes precedence, or how they must be harmonized to avoid legal repercussions. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the Alabama Electronic Commerce Act and its interplay with federal statutes governing electronic transactions, such as the Electronic Signatures in Global and National Commerce Act, e-Sign Act. This approach prioritizes identifying specific provisions within the Alabama Act that address issues like the validity of electronic records and signatures, consumer disclosures, and contract formation in an electronic environment. It then requires a comparative analysis to determine how these state-specific rules align with or are preempted by federal law. For instance, if the Alabama Act requires a specific method for consumer consent to electronic disclosures, and e-Sign provides a broader standard, the business must ensure its practices meet the more stringent requirement, or that e-Sign broader provisions are effectively utilized to satisfy both. This ensures legal certainty and protects consumers by adhering to the most protective standards. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the Alabama Electronic Commerce Act without considering federal implications. This failure to acknowledge the supremacy of federal law where applicable, such as e-Sign role in validating electronic signatures nationwide, could lead to noncompliance if the state law imposes requirements that are less protective or are preempted by federal mandates. Another incorrect approach is to assume that federal laws automatically supersede all state e-commerce regulations without a nuanced understanding of preemption principles. This could result in overlooking specific consumer protection measures or procedural requirements mandated by Alabama law that are not directly addressed or are less stringent under federal statutes. Finally, adopting a wait-and-see attitude, hoping that any potential issues will be resolved through future litigation or regulatory clarification, is professionally irresponsible and exposes the business to significant legal and financial risks. Professionals should adopt a proactive and comprehensive compliance strategy. This involves conducting regular legal reviews of their e-commerce practices, seeking expert legal counsel familiar with both Alabama and federal e-commerce law, and staying abreast of legislative and judicial developments. A risk-based assessment should be performed to identify areas of potential conflict or ambiguity between state and federal regulations, and mitigation strategies should be implemented to ensure adherence to the most stringent applicable requirements. Question 4. In Alabama, what are the primary considerations when evaluating whether an e-commerce advertisement for a miracle weight loss supplement claiming guaranteed results in 1 week constitutes an unfair trade practice or deceptive advertising under the Alabama Unfair Trade Practices Act? Option A. Whether the advertisement aligns with general marketing practices common in the health and wellness industry. Option B. Whether the advertisement uses hyperbolic language that could be interpreted as mere promotional exaggeration. Option C. Whether the advertiser subjectively believed the claims were true, regardless of objective evidence. Option D. Whether the advertisement makes specific, verifiable claims about the product's efficacy that are false or unsubstantiated, and if the overall impression conveyed is likely to mislead a reasonable Alabama consumer. The correct answer is D. Whether the advertisement makes specific, verifiable claims about the product's efficacy that are false or unsubstantiated, and if the overall impression conveyed is likely to mislead a reasonable Alabama consumer. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama's Unfair Trade Practices Act (UTPA) and deceptive advertising principles in the context of e-commerce, where representations can be easily disseminated and potentially misleading. The rapid nature of online marketing necessitates careful judgment to distinguish between legitimate promotional puffery and outright deception. The best approach involves a thorough analysis of the advertisement's content and context against the specific prohibitions of the Alabama UTPA. This means evaluating whether the claims made are factual, verifiable, and likely to mislead a reasonable consumer. Key considerations include the clarity of the language used, the presence of any disclaimers or qualifying statements, and the overall impression conveyed. If the advertisement makes specific, quantifiable claims about product performance or benefits that are demonstrably false or unsubstantiated, it likely constitutes a deceptive practice under Alabama law. This approach is correct because it directly applies the legal standards set forth in the Alabama UTPA, which prohibits deceptive acts or practices in commerce, including false or misleading advertising. The focus is on the objective impact of the advertisement on consumers and whether it creates a likelihood of confusion or misunderstanding. An approach that focuses solely on the advertiser's intent to deceive is insufficient. While intent can be a factor in some legal contexts, the Alabama UTPA primarily concerns the effect of the practice on consumers. An advertisement can be deceptive even if the advertiser did not consciously intend to mislead, if its net impression is misleading. Similarly, an approach that relies on general industry standards without reference to specific Alabama legal requirements is flawed. While industry norms can provide context, they do not supersede statutory obligations. Finally, an approach that dismisses the advertisement as mere puffery without a careful examination of its specific claims risks overlooking potentially deceptive statements. Puffery typically refers to exaggerated, subjective claims that a reasonable consumer would not take literally. However, if an advertisement makes specific factual assertions that are false, it moves beyond puffery and into the realm of deception. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the relevant jurisdiction's consumer protection laws, in this case Alabama UTPA. 2. Analyzing the advertisement's specific claims and overall impression. 3. Assessing whether these claims are factual, verifiable, and likely to mislead a reasonable consumer. 4. Considering the presence and clarity of any disclaimers. 5. Consulting legal counsel if there is any doubt about the advertisement's compliance. Question 5. The control framework reveals that in Alabama, when a consumer clicks "I agree" on a website's terms and conditions after being presented with those terms in a clear and conspicuous manner, what is the most legally sound determination regarding the formation of a contract? Option A. A contract is not formed until the consumer receives a separate email confirmation of their agreement to the terms, as this is the only definitive proof of acceptance. Option B. A binding contract is formed, as the affirmative click constitutes clear acceptance of the offer presented in the terms and conditions, satisfying the requirements for mutual assent under Alabama law and UTA. Option C. A contract is formed solely because the consumer added items to their online shopping cart, indicating intent to purchase. Option D. A contract is not formed because online terms and conditions are generally considered unenforceable unless physically signed. The correct answer is B. A binding contract is formed, as the affirmative click constitutes clear acceptance of the offer presented in the terms and conditions, satisfying the requirements for mutual assent under Alabama law and UTA. Explanation. The control framework reveals that navigating the formation of online contracts in Alabama requires a nuanced understanding of how traditional contract law principles are applied in the digital realm, particularly concerning offer, acceptance, and consideration. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that online interactions, which can be rapid and less formal than in-person agreements, still meet the legal requirements for a binding contract under Alabama law. This requires careful consideration of how electronic signatures, website terms of service, and click-wrap agreements function to establish mutual assent. The best approach involves a thorough examination of the website's design and the user's interaction to determine if a clear offer was made and unequivocally accepted, thereby forming a binding contract under Alabama law. This includes verifying that the terms and conditions were readily accessible and that the user's affirmative action, e.g., clicking, "I agree," demonstrated a clear intent to be bound. Alabama law, like general contract principles, requires mutual assent, and the digital environment must provide sufficient evidence of this assent. This approach aligns with Alabama's adoption of the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, UTA, which validates electronic signatures and records as having the same legal effect as their paper counterparts, provided certain conditions are met, ensuring that the online formation process is legally sound and enforceable. An approach that focuses solely on the presence of a terms and conditions link, without confirming user interaction or assent, is professionally unacceptable. It fails to establish mutual assent, a cornerstone of contract formation. Alabama law, through UTA, requires more than just the availability of terms. It necessitates evidence that the party intended to be bound by those terms. Similarly, an approach that assumes a contract is formed simply because a user browsed a website or added items to a virtual cart, without a clear affirmative act of acceptance of specific terms, is flawed. This overlooks the requirement for a definitive offer and acceptance. Finally, an approach that relies on the assumption that any online transaction automatically constitutes a binding agreement, regardless of the clarity of the offer or the user's understanding and acceptance of the terms, is a significant regulatory failure. It disregards the fundamental principles of contract law and the specific provisions of Alabama's UTA, which aim to provide certainty and enforceability to electronic transactions. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes verifying the elements of contract formation in the online context. This involves 1. Identifying the offer. Was a clear offer made by one party? 2. Assessing acceptance. Did the other party unequivocally accept the offer? 3. Confirming consideration. Was there an exchange of value? 4. Ensuring mutual assent. Was there a meeting of the minds regarding the essential terms? 5. Verifying compliance with UTA. Were electronic signatures and records used in a manner that complies with Alabama law? This systematic approach ensures that online agreements are legally robust and enforceable. Question 6. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of Alabama-based businesses are increasingly utilizing electronic signatures for contractual agreements. A company in Alabama is preparing to execute a high-value service contract with a new client. The company's IT department has proposed using a simple click-to-agree button on their website, where the client would click to indicate their acceptance of the contract terms. What is the most legally sound approach to ensure the electronic signature is valid under Alabama law? Option A. Advise the client that while an electronic signature is being used, the company will not guarantee its legal validity in Alabama and will rely on a subsequent paper-based signature for full enforceability. Option B. Utilize a system where the client's IP address is logged when they click the Agree button, as this provides sufficient evidence of their presence and intent to sign, Option C. Implement a process that requires the client to affirmatively indicate their intent to sign the contract electronically and ensures the signature is reliably linked to the client and the contract, consistent with the Alabama Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. Option D. Proceed with the Click to Agree button, assuming that any affirmative action taken by the client on an electronic document constitutes a legally binding signature under Alabama law. The correct answer is C. Implement a process that requires the client to affirmatively indicate their intent to sign the contract electronically and ensures the signature is reliably linked to the client and the contract, consistent with the Alabama Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the specific legal requirements for electronic signatures in Alabama, particularly when dealing with a contract that has significant financial implications. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these requirements can render the electronic signature invalid, potentially voiding the contract and leading to legal disputes and financial losses for the company. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama law, which prioritizes clear intent and a reliable method of authentication. The best professional approach involves ensuring the electronic signature process meets the standards set forth by Alabama law, specifically the Alabama Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, (AUTA). This means verifying that the signer intended to sign the document and that the electronic signature is linked to the record, and the signer in a way that is reliable for the purpose for which the record was generated or communicated. This approach prioritizes legal validity by focusing on the core principles of intent and reliability, which are central to AUTA framework for recognizing electronic signatures. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any electronic mark or symbol constitutes a legally valid signature. This fails to recognize that Alabama law, through AUTA, requires more than just a mark. It demands a demonstrable intent to sign and a reliable method of associating the signature with the individual and the document. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the ease of using a simple click-to-agree mechanism without any further verification of the signer's identity or intent. This overlooks the requirement for reliability and the potential for unauthorized use, which can invalidate the signature under AUTA. Finally, assuming that a signature is valid simply because it appears on an electronic document, without considering the specific legal framework of Alabama, is a significant ethical and legal failure. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the statutory requirements designed to protect parties entering into electronic agreements. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the relevant jurisdiction's electronic transaction laws. In this case, it's Alabama's AUTA. Next, they must analyze the specific requirements of that law regarding intent, reliability, and the association of the signature with the record and the signer. The chosen electronic signature method should then be evaluated against these legal standards. If there is any doubt about compliance, seeking legal counsel specializing in e-commerce law in Alabama is a prudent step to ensure the validity of electronic signatures and the enforceability of contracts. Question 7. Market research demonstrates that consumers in Alabama are increasingly engaging in online purchases. A new e-commerce business operating within Alabama is developing its website and needs to implement a strategy for its terms and conditions. Which of the following approaches best ensures legal enforceability and consumer protection under Alabama law? Option A. Provide a link to the terms and conditions on a separate legal page that is not directly linked from the main navigation or checkout process. Option B. State in the terms and conditions that by using the website, the user agrees to be bound by them and make the terms accessible via a link on the home page. Option C. Prominently display a link to the terms and conditions on every page of the website and require users to actively check a box indicating they have read and agreed to the terms before proceeding to checkout. Option D. Include a link to the terms and conditions in the footer of the website, assuming that users who continue to browse or purchase implicitly agree to them. Correct answer is C. Prominently display a link to the terms and conditions on every page of the website and require users to actively check a box indicating they have read and agreed to the terms before proceeding to checkout. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a business operating in Alabama's e-commerce space to balance the need for clear contractual terms with the practicalities of online consumer interaction. Ensuring that terms and conditions are not only accessible, but also demonstrably agreed upon by consumers, is crucial for legal enforceability and consumer protection under Alabama law. The core issue revolves around how to effectively communicate and obtain assent to these terms in a digital environment. The best approach involves proactively presenting the terms and conditions in a manner that requires explicit consumer action to indicate agreement before a transaction is finalized. This typically means linking to the terms and requiring a checkbox to be ticked, or a similar affirmative action that signifies the consumer has read, understood, and agreed to be bound by them. This method aligns with Alabama's general contract principles and the spirit of consumer protection laws that emphasize informed consent. By requiring an affirmative step, the business creates a clear record of agreement, minimizing disputes regarding whether the consumer was aware of and accepted the terms. This proactive disclosure and explicit assent are fundamental to establishing a legally binding contract in e-commerce. An approach that merely provides a link to the terms and conditions without requiring any affirmative action from the consumer before completing the purchase is professionally unacceptable. This passive display risks being interpreted as an attempt to impose terms without genuine consent, potentially rendering the terms unenforceable in an Alabama court. Consumers might not click the link, or if they do, they may not read them, and the lack of an explicit affirmative action leaves a gap in demonstrating agreement. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to bury the terms and conditions deep within a website's footer or in a separate, non-obvious location, and then claim that their presence constitutes agreement. This lack of conspicuousness fails to provide reasonable notice to the consumer, undermining the principle of informed consent. Alabama law, like most jurisdictions, expects terms to be readily accessible and brought to the consumer's attention in a way that a reasonable person would notice them. Finally, an approach that relies on implied consent through continued use of the website after a transaction is also problematic. While some jurisdictions may permit this in certain contexts, it is a weaker form of assent and is more susceptible to legal challenge in Alabama, especially for significant contractual terms. It does not provide the clear, affirmative evidence of agreement that is ideal for e-commerce transactions and consumer protection. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency and explicit consumer consent. This involves designing the e-commerce interface to prominently display and require affirmative agreement to terms and conditions before the completion of any transaction. Regular review of these processes against current Alabama e-commerce and consumer protection guidance is also essential to maintain compliance and ethical standards. Question 8. Market research demonstrates that an Alabama-based online retailer specializing in custom-designed jewelry is experiencing significant growth. To streamline its checkout process and encourage faster sales, the retailer is considering modifying its website. The proposed changes include replacing the current prominent "Agree to Terms and Conditions" button with a subtle hyperlink at the bottom of the checkout page, and significantly shortening the visible terms of service, requiring users to click a separate, less obvious link to view the full document. The retailer also plans to remove the explicit mention of a 30-day return policy from the main checkout summary, instead directing customers to a separate policies page for such details. Which of the following approaches best aligns with Alabama's consumer protection laws regarding online contracts? Option A. Assume consumer consent to all terms and conditions by their continued browsing of the website, without requiring an affirmative action to agree to specific terms at the point of sale. Option B. Implement a brief, generalized statement of terms and conditions apply at the checkout, with a single hyperlink to a separate page containing all detailed policies. Option C. Bury critical terms such as cancellation policies and hidden fees within lengthy, dense text that is difficult for the average consumer to locate or understand, assuming consumers will eventually find them if they look hard enough. Option D. Ensure all terms and conditions, including privacy policies and return policies, are clearly and conspicuously displayed or linked to asterisk before asterisk. The consumer is prompted to complete their purchase, using plain and understandable language. The correct answer is D. Ensure all terms and conditions, including privacy policies and return policies, are clearly and conspicuously displayed or linked to asterisk before asterisk. The consumer is prompted to complete their purchase, using plain and understandable language. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the desire to expand a business's reach through e-commerce with the stringent consumer protection mandates under Alabama law. Navigating the nuances of online contract formation, particularly regarding disclosure and consent, is critical to avoiding legal repercussions and maintaining consumer trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure all online interactions comply with the Alabama Deceptive Trade Practices Act and related consumer protection statutes. The best professional approach involves proactively ensuring that all terms and conditions of an online contract are clearly and conspicuously displayed the consumer before they are asked to agree to them. This includes providing readily accessible links to privacy policies and return policies, and using clear, unambiguous language to describe the goods or services being offered and the total cost. This approach aligns directly with Alabama's consumer protection laws, which emphasize transparency and informed consent in contractual agreements. Specifically, the Alabama Deceptive Trade Practices Act prohibits deceptive acts or practices in connection with the sale or advertisement of any goods or services, and this proactive disclosure ensures consumers are not misled about the terms of their purchase. Ethical considerations also strongly support this approach, as it respects the consumer's right to make an informed decision. An approach that relies on a brief, generalized statement of terms and conditions apply, without providing immediate access to those terms before purchase, is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the Alabama requirement for clear and conspicuous disclosure, potentially misleading consumers about their rights and obligations. It also violates the spirit of consumer protection by obscuring important contractual details. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to bury the most critical terms, such as cancellation policies or hidden fees, in lengthy, dense text that is difficult for the average consumer to locate or understand. This practice is deceptive and undermines the principle of informed consent, which is a cornerstone of Alabama consumer law. Finally, an approach that assumes consumer consent simply by their continued browsing of the website, without an affirmative action to agree to specific terms, is also problematic. Alabama law generally requires a more explicit form of assent for online contracts to be considered valid and enforceable, particularly when significant consumer rights are involved. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough review of Alabama's consumer protection statutes, particularly those related to e-commerce and deceptive trade practices. Businesses should prioritize transparency, clarity, and ease of access to all contractual information for consumers. Implementing a click-to-agree mechanism with clearly presented terms and conditions, along with readily available links to related policies, is a robust strategy to ensure compliance and foster consumer confidence. Question 9. Governance review demonstrates that an Alabama-based e-commerce business is facing an increasing volume of customer disputes. To address this, the business is considering several strategies for dispute resolution. Which of the following strategies best aligns with Alabama's e-commerce and consumer protection laws while promoting efficient and fair resolution? Option A. Implement a multi-tiered approach that begins with direct negotiation and customer service outreach, followed by voluntary mediation if direct resolution fails, and finally, binding arbitration as a last resort for unresolved disputes. Option B. Establish a policy of responding to customer disputes only after a formal complaint has been filed with a state regulatory agency. Option C. Create a complex and lengthy online form for dispute submission that requires extensive documentation upfront, with a disclaimer that the business is not obligated to respond within a specific timeframe. Option D. Mandate binding arbitration for all customer disputes from the outset, requiring customers to agree to this clause before completing any transaction. The correct answer is A. Implement a multi-tiered approach that begins with direct negotiation and customer service outreach, followed by voluntary mediation if direct resolution fails, and finally, binding arbitration as a last resort for unresolved disputes. Explanation. Governance review demonstrates that an Alabama-based e-commerce business, Dixie Deals, has experienced a significant increase in customer disputes arising from online transactions. The company's current informal approach to resolving these issues is proving inefficient and is leading to customer dissatisfaction and potential legal exposure under Alabama law. The challenge lies in establishing a robust and legally compliant dispute resolution framework that balances efficiency, fairness, and adherence to Alabama's e-commerce and consumer protection statutes. The most effective approach involves implementing a multi-tiered dispute resolution strategy that prioritizes informal negotiation and mediation before escalating to more formal processes. This aligns with the spirit of Alabama's consumer protection laws, which encourage amicable resolutions and provide avenues for consumers to seek redress. By offering clear, accessible channels for initial communication and negotiation, Dixie deals can often resolve issues quickly and cost-effectively, preserving customer relationships. If direct negotiation fails, engaging a neutral third-party mediator, ideally one familiar with Alabama consumer law, can facilitate a mutually agreeable settlement. This tiered approach is proactive, customer-centric, and minimizes the likelihood of protracted and expensive litigation, thereby adhering to the principles of efficient dispute resolution encouraged by Alabama statutes. An approach that solely relies on immediate escalation to binding arbitration without prior attempts at negotiation or mediation is procedurally flawed. While arbitration can be an efficient dispute resolution mechanism, mandating it as the first and only option bypasses opportunities for less adversarial and more cost-effective resolutions. This can be perceived as an attempt to limit consumer recourse and may face scrutiny under Alabama consumer protection laws that aim to ensure fair access to dispute resolution. Another unacceptable approach is to ignore customer disputes or provide no clear process for resolution. This directly contravenes Alabama's consumer protection statutes, which impose obligations on businesses to address customer grievances. Such inaction not only leads to customer dissatisfaction and reputational damage, but also exposes the business to potential enforcement actions and penalties under state law. Finally, adopting a dispute resolution process that is opaque, difficult to access, or heavily favors the business without providing adequate recourse for consumers is ethically and legally problematic. Alabama law expects businesses to operate with transparency and fairness, and dispute resolution mechanisms must reflect these principles. A process that is designed to be a barrier rather than a facilitator of resolution will likely be deemed unfair and non-compliant with state regulations. Professionals should approach dispute resolution by first understanding the specific legal landscape of Alabama governing e-commerce and consumer rights. This involves identifying statutory requirements for dispute resolution, such as notice provisions, cooling-off periods, and the availability of mediation or arbitration. A robust framework should then be designed with a clear escalation path, starting with accessible informal channels and progressing to more formal mechanisms only when necessary. Regular review and adaptation of these processes based on customer feedback and legal developments are crucial for maintaining compliance and customer trust. Question 10. Market research demonstrates that an e-commerce business operating in Alabama collects customer names, email addresses, purchase history, and IP addresses. The business intends to use this data for targeted advertising and to improve its website's user experience. The business is considering how to best comply with Alabama's privacy regulations. If the business's total revenue for the preceding calendar year was $50 million and it processed the personal data of 100,000 Alabama residents, what is the maximum potential statutory penalty per violation under the Alabama Data Privacy Act, ADPA, if it fails to provide adequate notice and choice regarding the sale of personal data? Option A, $5,000 per violation. Option B, $10,000 per violation. Option C, $7,500 per violation. Option D, $2,500 per violation. The correct answer is C, $7,500 per violation. Explanation: market research demonstrates that consumers in Alabama are increasingly concerned about how their personal data is collected and used by e-commerce businesses. This scenario presents a professional challenge for businesses operating in Alabama, because they must balance the desire to gather data for marketing and service improvement with the legal and ethical obligations to protect consumer privacy. Failure to comply with Alabama's specific e-commerce and data protection regulations can lead to significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure all data handling practices are transparent, lawful, and respectful of consumer rights. The approach that represents best professional practice involves a proactive and comprehensive assessment of data collection and usage against the Alabama Data Privacy Act, IDPA. This includes identifying all types of personal data collected, the purposes for collection, the duration of storage, and the third parties with whom data is shared. Based on this assessment, a clear, concise, and easily accessible privacy policy must be developed and prominently displayed on the e-commerce website. This policy should detail consumer rights under the IDPA, such as the right to access, correct, delete, and opt out of the sale of personal data, and provide clear instructions on how consumers can exercise these rights. Furthermore, implementing robust data security measures and obtaining explicit consent where required by the IDPA are crucial components of this approach. This is correct because it directly addresses the requirements of the IDPA, ensuring full compliance and fostering consumer trust through transparency and control over personal information. An approach that involves only a generic privacy policy, without specific reference to Alabama's IDPA or the types of data collected by the business, is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the specific disclosure requirements mandated by Alabama law, leaving consumers uninformed about their rights and the business vulnerable to non-compliance penalties. An approach that focuses solely on collecting as much data as possible for marketing purposes, with a minimal and vague privacy statement, is also professionally unacceptable. This disregards the consumer's right to privacy and the IDPA provisions for data minimization and purpose limitation, potentially leading to legal action and severe reputational damage. An approach that relies on implied consent for data collection and sharing, without obtaining explicit consent for sensitive data or the sale of personal information as required by the IDPA, is professionally unacceptable. This violates the IDPA consent requirements, undermining consumer autonomy and exposing the business to significant legal risks. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the applicable state-specific e-commerce and data privacy laws, such as the IDPA. Businesses should conduct regular data audits, consult with legal counsel specializing in data privacy, and prioritize transparency and consumer control in all data handling practices. This systematic approach ensures compliance, mitigates risk, and builds a foundation of trust with consumers. Question 11. Process analysis reveals that an Alabama-based e-commerce platform is experiencing an increasing number of user-uploaded product listings that may infringe on existing copyrights. The platform's legal team is considering various strategies to address these potential infringements while minimizing legal risk. Which of the following approaches best aligns with Alabama's regulatory framework for intellectual property rights in e-commerce? Option A. Advise users that the platform is not liable for any copyright infringement and that all intellectual property disputes are solely between the infringing user and the copyright holder. Option B. Adopt a policy of immediately removing any user-uploaded content upon receiving a complaint from any third party without verifying the complaint's validity or allowing the user to respond. Option C. Proactively scan all user-uploaded content for potential copyright violations using automated software before it is published, and automatically remove any content flagged as potentially infringing. Option D. Implement a comprehensive notice and takedown system that adheres to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act's requirements, including procedures for both copyright holders to report infringement and for users to submit counter-notifications. The correct answer is D. Implement a comprehensive notice and takedown system that adheres to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act's requirements, including procedures for both copyright holders to report infringement and for users to submit counter-notifications. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of intellectual property protection in the digital realm, particularly within the specific legal framework of Alabama. E-commerce platforms often facilitate the rapid dissemination of content, making it difficult to control unauthorized use of copyrighted material. A professional must navigate Alabama's specific statutes and case law concerning copyright infringement and fair use in an online context, balancing the rights of creators with the principles of open access and innovation. Misinterpreting these rights can lead to significant legal liabilities for the e-commerce platform and its users. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves proactively implementing a robust notice and takedown system that complies with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, as interpreted and applied within Alabama's jurisdiction. This system requires clear procedures for copyright holders to notify the platform of infringing material, and for the platform to expeditiously remove or disable access to that material upon receiving a valid notice. Crucially, it also includes provisions for counter notices from users who believe their content was removed in error, ensuring due process. This approach is correct because it aligns with federal safe harbor provisions designed to protect online service providers from liability for user-generated content, provided they adhere to specific notice and takedown requirements. Alabama courts, like federal courts, would look to these established DMCA procedures as the benchmark for responsible online platform operation concerning copyright. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to ignore user complaints about potential copyright infringement, assuming the platform is not directly responsible for user actions. This fails to acknowledge the platform's role as a facilitator and the legal obligations that arise from that role. Alabama law, following federal precedent, can hold platforms liable if they have actual knowledge of infringement and fail to act, or if they contribute to or induce infringement. Another incorrect approach is to immediately remove any content flagged as infringing without providing the user who posted it an opportunity to respond or dispute the claim. This disregards the rights of users and the potential for erroneous takedowns, which can lead to claims of defamation or wrongful interference. It also bypasses the counter-notification process established by the DMCA, which is a critical component of the safe harbor provisions. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on user-generated terms of service that broadly disclaim all liability for intellectual property violations without establishing any operational procedures to address such violations. While terms of service are important, they cannot override statutory requirements or established legal principles regarding a platform's duty to act upon notice of infringement. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and compliance-oriented mindset. When faced with intellectual property disputes in an e-commerce context within Alabama, the decision-making process should prioritize establishing and diligently maintaining a DMCA-compliant notice and takedown system. This involves understanding the specific requirements for valid notices and counter-notices, training staff on these procedures, and regularly reviewing and updating the system to reflect evolving legal interpretations and technological advancements. The goal is to create a framework that effectively balances the protection of intellectual property with the rights of users and the platform's ability to operate without undue liability. Question 12. Market research demonstrates that an e-commerce business based in Georgia, which primarily hosts its digital content on servers located in California, is experiencing significant traffic from consumers within Alabama. The business utilizes a variety of digital content, including blog posts, product images, and short video advertisements, and is concerned about potential copyright infringement claims under Alabama law. Which of the following approaches best addresses the business's copyright concerns in relation to its digital content accessed by Alabama consumers? Option A. Rely solely on general Internet terms of service and boilerplate copyright notices, assuming they provide sufficient protection under Alabama law. Option B. Assume that because the content is hosted outside of Alabama and the business is not physically located there, Alabama copyright law does not apply to its digital content. Option C. Adopt a reactive strategy, addressing any copyright issues only if a formal complaint or lawsuit is filed by an Alabama resident or entity. Option D. Proactively seek legal counsel from an attorney specializing in Alabama e-commerce and copyright law to review all digital content and operational practices for compliance. The correct answer is D. Proactively seek legal counsel from an attorney specializing in Alabama e-commerce and copyright law to review all digital content and operational practices for compliance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in e-commerce, navigating copyright protections for digital content when operating across state lines, specifically within Alabama. The core difficulty lies in understanding how Alabama's e-commerce laws, particularly those pertaining to intellectual property, apply to content created and hosted elsewhere, but accessed by Alabama consumers. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to avoid infringing on copyright holders' rights, while also ensuring their own digital assets are adequately protected. Misinterpreting these laws can lead to significant legal liabilities, including damages and injunctions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively seeking legal counsel specializing in Alabama e-commerce and copyright law. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the complexities of jurisdiction and intellectual property rights within the specified state. Alabama law, like federal copyright law, grants exclusive rights to creators. By consulting with an attorney, a business can receive tailored advice on how to ensure their digital content, and the content they use, complies with Alabama's specific legal interpretations and enforcement mechanisms for copyright. This proactive step mitigates risk by ensuring all digital activities, from content creation to distribution and licensing, are legally sound within Alabama's purview. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that because the content is hosted on servers outside of Alabama or created by individuals outside of Alabama, Alabama copyright law does not apply. This is a significant regulatory failure because Alabama courts can assert jurisdiction over e-commerce activities that have a substantial effect within the state, regardless of the physical location of the servers or creators. If Alabama residents are accessing and interacting with the digital content, the state has a legitimate interest in protecting copyright holders and consumers within its borders. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on general Internet terms of service or boilerplate copyright notices without verifying their specific applicability and enforceability under Alabama law. While these documents can provide a baseline, they may not fully address the nuances of Alabama's statutory or case law regarding digital content and copyright. This approach fails to meet the standard of due diligence required to ensure compliance with specific state regulations, potentially leaving the business vulnerable to claims of infringement. A further incorrect approach is to adopt a wait-and-see attitude, only addressing copyright issues if a complaint or lawsuit arises. This reactive strategy is ethically and legally unsound. It demonstrates a disregard for the rights of copyright holders and exposes the business to substantial financial penalties and reputational damage. Alabama law, in line with federal principles, emphasizes the importance of respecting intellectual property rights, and a failure to do so proactively is a clear ethical and regulatory breach. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing this situation should employ a risk-based decision-making framework. First, identify the specific digital content and the nature of its distribution and access. Second, determine the potential exposure to Alabama law based on the presence and interaction of Alabama consumers. Third, assess the existing copyright compliance measures. Fourth, prioritize seeking expert legal advice from attorneys familiar with Alabama e-commerce and copyright law to ensure all activities are compliant. This systematic approach minimizes legal and ethical risks. Question 13. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a small business in Alabama operating an e-commerce platform has discovered a competitor using a logo that is confusingly similar to its registered trademark. What is the most prudent and legally sound course of action to protect its trademark rights under Alabama e-commerce law? Option A. Engage in online counter-marketing campaigns to discredit the competitor and highlight the trademark similarity to deter further infringement. Option B. Immediately file a lawsuit in an Alabama court seeking an injunction and damages without any prior communication with the infringing party. Option C. Send a formal cease and desist letter drafted by an attorney detailing the infringement and demanding its immediate cessation, while reserving the right to pursue further legal action if necessary. Option D. Ignore the infringement, assuming it is minor and will not significantly impact the business's market share or brand reputation. The correct answer is C. Send a formal cease and desist letter drafted by an attorney detailing the infringement and demanding its immediate cessation, while reserving the right to pursue further legal action if necessary. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the desire to leverage online platforms for business growth with the legal obligation to protect intellectual property rights, specifically trademarks, within the framework of Alabama e-commerce law. The ease of online replication and distribution means that trademark infringement can occur rapidly and on a global scale, making proactive and legally sound strategies crucial. Failure to adequately protect trademarks can lead to significant financial losses, damage to brand reputation, and costly litigation. Careful judgment is required to identify potential infringements and to implement appropriate legal remedies without overstepping boundaries or incurring unnecessary legal expenses. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multifaceted approach that prioritizes clear evidence gathering and a measured, legally compliant response. This includes thoroughly documenting the suspected infringement, identifying the specific trademark being infringed, and confirming that the infringing use is likely to cause consumer confusion regarding the source or sponsorship of goods or services. The next step is to send a cease and desist letter, drafted by legal counsel specializing in Alabama intellectual property law, clearly outlining the infringement and demanding its immediate cessation. This letter should be firm but professional, providing a reasonable time frame for compliance and indicating a willingness to resolve the matter amicably. If the infringement continues, then pursuing legal action, such as filing a lawsuit in an appropriate Alabama court, becomes the necessary next step. This approach is correct because it adheres to the principles of due process, provides the infringing party with an opportunity to rectify the situation, and builds a strong evidentiary foundation for potential litigation, all within the established legal framework for trademark protection in Alabama. Incorrect approach is analysis. Immediately initiating legal proceedings without prior communication or evidence gathering is an incorrect approach. This can be seen as overly aggressive, potentially alienating a customer or competitor unnecessarily, and may lead to higher legal costs without first exploring less adversarial resolutions. Furthermore, it might be perceived as a failure to conduct due diligence, as it bypasses the opportunity to gather more comprehensive evidence or to understand the infringer's intent. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the infringement, hoping it will resolve itself or that it is too minor to warrant action. This is a significant ethical and legal failure. Under Alabama law, trademark owners have a responsibility to police their marks. Allowing infringement to persist can weaken the trademark's distinctiveness and make it harder to enforce in the future, potentially leading to the abandonment of trademark rights. This passive stance can also be interpreted as a waiver of rights. Finally, engaging in retaliatory online tactics, such as posting negative reviews or attempting to disrupt the infringing party's online presence, is an unprofessional and legally risky approach. Such actions can expose the trademark owner to counterclaims for defamation, tortious interference, or other legal liabilities, diverting attention from the core trademark infringement issue and potentially creating more legal problems than they solve. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic and legally informed decision-making process when addressing trademark infringement in e-commerce. This process begins with a thorough assessment of the situation, focusing on gathering objective evidence of infringement and its potential impact. Legal counsel specializing in Alabama e-commerce and intellectual property law should be consulted early to understand the specific rights and remedies available. The next step involves a strategic communication plan, typically starting with a cease and desist letter, which serves as a formal notice and an opportunity for resolution. If these efforts are unsuccessful, a carefully considered escalation to legal action should be pursued, always prioritizing compliance with Alabama statutes and case law. This structured approach ensures that actions are legally defensible, cost-effective, and aligned with the goal of protecting the brand's intellectual property. Question 14. Cost-benefit analysis shows that launching a novel online subscription service for personalized educational content in Alabama could be highly profitable, but the founders are concerned about protecting their unique operational approach and avoiding infringement. Which of the following actions best addresses these patent considerations for their Alabama-based e-commerce venture? Option A. Prioritize securing domain names and social media handles, believing that controlling online presence is the primary defense against intellectual property challenges for an e-commerce business. Option B. Launch the service immediately and rely on the abstract nature of the business model to avoid patent issues, focusing only on securing a strong brand name through trademark registration. Option C. Assume that existing patents are unlikely to cover their specific online educational content delivery method and proceed without any formal patent review. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive patentability search and consult with an Alabama-licensed patent attorney to assess the novelty, non-obviousness, and potential infringement risks associated with their business model. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive patentability search and consult with an Alabama-licensed patent attorney to assess the novelty, non-obviousness, and potential infringement risks associated with their business model. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for online businesses in Alabama, navigating patent law to protect their innovative business models without infringing on existing patents. The difficulty lies in the abstract nature of business method patents and the broad scope of claims that can be granted. A business owner must balance the desire for exclusivity and competitive advantage with the legal obligation to respect the intellectual property rights of others. Failure to do so can lead to costly litigation, injunctions, and significant financial penalties, all of which can cripple an Alabama-based e-commerce venture. Careful judgment is required to assess the novelty and non-obviousness of their own model, and to conduct thorough due diligence regarding potential infringement. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves conducting a thorough patentability search and seeking legal counsel from an Alabama-licensed patent attorney to assess the novelty and non-obviousness of the proposed online business model. This approach is correct because it proactively addresses potential patent issues. A patentability search, conducted before significant investment, helps determine if the business model is likely eligible for patent protection, and crucially, if it infringes on existing patents. Engaging an attorney ensures that the assessment is made within the specific legal framework of U.S. patent law, as interpreted and applied in Alabama. This aligns with the ethical obligation to operate legally and the professional responsibility to mitigate foreseeable risks. It allows for informed decisions regarding patent filing, business model adjustments, or licensing. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the business model without any patent search or legal consultation is professionally unacceptable. This approach ignores the fundamental requirement to respect intellectual property rights and carries a high risk of infringement. Alabama businesses are subject to federal patent law, and ignorance of existing patents is not a defense. Assuming that an online business model is too abstract to be patented or to infringe on existing patents is a flawed assumption. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office has granted patents for various business methods, and courts have upheld their validity. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of patent law and a failure to conduct necessary due diligence, leading to potential legal liabilities. Focusing solely on trademark protection for the business name and logo, while important for branding, is insufficient for protecting the underlying operational model. Trademarks protect brand identity, not the functional or conceptual innovation of a business process. This approach neglects the distinct legal protections afforded by patents for business methods and creates a significant vulnerability. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama should adopt a risk-based approach to intellectual property. This involves 1. Identifying potential intellectual property assets, including business models, software, and branding. 2. Conducting thorough searches to understand the existing patent landscape and identify potential prior art or infringing technologies. 3. Seeking specialized legal advice from qualified professionals such as patent attorneys to interpret search results and assess legal risks. 4. Making informed decisions based on this analysis, which may include filing for patent protection, modifying the business model, seeking licenses, or accepting certain risks. 5. Continuously monitoring the legal and competitive landscape for changes that may affect intellectual property rights. Question 15. Operational review demonstrates that an e-commerce business operating in Alabama has implemented an automated system for processing customer returns and issuing refunds. The system automatically confirms receipt of returned items and initiates the refund process. However, the system is configured to require a manual review and approval for every refund, regardless of the return's validity or the item's condition, before the refund is actually disbursed. This manual step often introduces a delay of several business days beyond the initial confirmation of receipt. Considering Alabama's consumer protection framework for e-commerce, which of the following approaches best ensures compliance and upholds consumer rights regarding refunds? Option A. Modify the automated system to only initiate the refund process after a customer explicitly requests a refund for a second time, ensuring they are aware of the return. Option B. Redesign the automated system to automatically disburse refunds within a legally stipulated timeframe after the return is confirmed received, provided the return meets predefined, objective criteria, and to send automated notifications to consumers at each stage, including an estimated refund credit timeframe. Option C. Continue with the current process, relying on manual review for all refunds, and inform customers that delays are due to internal processing, without specifying a time frame. Option D. Implement a policy where the automated system only flags returns for manual review if the returned item is significantly damaged, and all other refunds are processed automatically without explicit consumer notification of the refund credit timeframe. The correct answer is B. Redesign the automated system to automatically disperse refunds within a legally stipulated timeframe after the return is confirmed received, provided the return meets predefined, objective criteria, and to send automated notifications to consumers at each stage, including an estimated refund credit timeframe. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a business operating in Alabama's e-commerce space to balance efficient operational processes with robust consumer protection under Alabama law. The core challenge lies in ensuring that the company's automated systems for handling returns and refunds do not inadvertently violate consumers' statutory rights, particularly concerning timely processing and clear communication, which are fundamental to trust and compliance in e-commerce. Failure to do so can lead to regulatory scrutiny, consumer complaints, and reputational damage. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves proactively integrating consumer rights into the automated return and refund system. This means designing the system to automatically trigger refund processing within the legally mandated timeframe after a return is confirmed received, and ensuring clear, automated notifications are sent to the consumer at each stage of the process. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the spirit and letter of Alabama's consumer protection laws, which emphasize fairness, transparency, and prompt resolution of disputes. By embedding these rights into the operational workflow, the company not only ensures compliance, but also enhances customer satisfaction and builds a reputation for reliability. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely on manual intervention for all refund approvals, even after an item has been verified as returned. This is professionally unacceptable because it introduces significant delays, increasing the risk of violating Alabama's statutory requirements for timely refunds. Such a delay can be perceived as unfair practice and may lead to consumer complaints and potential legal action. Another incorrect approach is to only notify consumers of refund initiation without providing an estimated timeframe for when the funds will be credited back to their account. This fails to meet the expectation of transparency and clear communication that is implicitly required under consumer protection principles. Consumers have a right to know when to expect their money back, and a lack of this information can lead to frustration and distrust. A further incorrect approach is to have the automated system automatically deny refunds for minor discrepancies in product condition without a human review, especially if the discrepancy does not materially affect the product's value or functionality. This can be seen as an overly rigid application of policy that may not align with the reasonable expectations of consumers or the spirit of consumer protection laws, which often allow for reasonable discretion in such matters. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and compliance-first mindset when designing and implementing e-commerce systems. The decision-making process should involve a thorough understanding of Alabama's specific consumer protection statutes related to online transactions, including those governing returns, refunds, and disclosure requirements. Before deploying any automated system, a risk assessment should be conducted to identify potential points of noncompliance. Regular audits and updates to these systems are also crucial to ensure ongoing adherence to evolving legal standards and consumer expectations. The ultimate goal is to build systems that not only operate efficiently, but also demonstrably uphold consumer rights. Question 16. The monitoring system demonstrates that an Alabama-based online retailer has not prominently displayed its return policy prior to the finalization of customer purchases. Considering the importance of e-commerce law in the digital economy and the specific regulatory landscape of Alabama, what is the most appropriate course of action for the retailer to ensure compliance and protect consumer rights? Option A. Immediately update the website to ensure the return policy is clearly and conspicuously presented to customers before they complete their purchase, making it an integral part of the checkout process. Option B. Rely on the existing link to the return policy located in the website's footer, assuming customers can access it if they choose to search for it. Option C. Interpret the monitoring system's alert as a suggestion rather than a strict requirement, and continue with current practices unless legally mandated otherwise. Option D. Consider the alert a minor issue and address it only if a customer explicitly complains about the return policy visibility. The correct answer is A. Immediately update the website to ensure the return policy is clearly and conspicuously presented to customers before they complete their purchase, making it an integral part of the checkout process. Explanation: the monitoring system demonstrates a potential violation of Alabama e-commerce law by flagging an online retailer's failure to clearly disclose its return policy before a customer completes a purchase. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing business efficiency with consumer protection mandates. The retailer faces potential legal repercussions, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust if the disclosure is deemed insufficient under Alabama law. Careful judgment is required to interpret the nuances of the law and implement compliant practices. The correct approach involves proactively reviewing and updating the website's user interface to ensure the return policy is prominently displayed and easily accessible to customers before they finalize their transaction. This aligns with the spirit and letter of Alabama's e-commerce regulations, which emphasize transparency and consumer rights in online transactions. By making the return policy a clear and unavoidable step in the purchasing process, the retailer demonstrates a commitment to compliance and ethical business practices, thereby mitigating legal risks and fostering customer confidence. This proactive measure directly addresses the identified deficiency and prevents future violations. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a link to the return policy buried within the website's footer is sufficient. This fails to meet the legal requirement for clear and conspicuous disclosure at the point of sale, as mandated by Alabama e-commerce statutes designed to protect consumers from hidden terms and conditions. Such an approach risks legal penalties and erodes trust. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the monitoring system's alert as a minor technicality, relying on the argument that customers can find the policy if they look hard enough. This demonstrates a disregard for regulatory obligations and a lack of commitment to consumer protection, which is a cornerstone of Alabama's e-commerce legal framework. This attitude can lead to significant legal and financial consequences. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to only address the issue after a formal complaint has been filed by a consumer or regulatory body. This reactive stance is not only inefficient, but also exposes the business to greater liability and reputational damage. Alabama e-commerce law encourages proactive compliance to safeguard both businesses and consumers. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific requirements of Alabama e-commerce law, particularly concerning consumer disclosures. This involves regular audits of online platforms, seeking legal counsel when interpreting complex regulations, and fostering a culture of compliance within the organization. When a potential issue is identified, the immediate step should be to assess its regulatory implications and implement corrective actions that ensure full adherence to the law, rather than seeking the path of least resistance. Question 17. Regulatory review indicates that an e-commerce company operating in Alabama has collected customer purchase history data with the explicit consent for order fulfillment and customer service. The company now wishes to use this data to send targeted marketing emails to these Alabama residents. What is the most compliant and ethically sound approach for the company to proceed? Option A. Proceed with sending marketing emails, assuming consent for marketing is implied by the initial purchase and customer relationship. Option B. Obtain explicit, opt-in consent from Alabama residents specifically for receiving marketing emails, clearly outlining the types of marketing content and providing an easy opt-out mechanism. Option C. Use the purchase history data for internal analysis to identify marketing trends, but refrain from sending direct marketing emails without further consent. Option D. Send marketing emails to all Alabama residents who have purchased from the company, including a general opt-out notice within the email footer. Correct answer is B. Obtain explicit, opt-in consent from Alabama residents specifically for receiving marketing emails, clearly outlining the types of marketing content and providing an easy opt-out mechanism. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing a company's desire to leverage customer data for marketing with the stringent data protection obligations imposed by Alabama law. The core tension lies in obtaining valid consent for data processing, especially when the initial purpose of data collection was different. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance and maintain customer trust. The best approach involves proactively seeking explicit consent from Alabama residents for the secondary use of their data in marketing campaigns. This means clearly informing individuals about how their data will be used for marketing, the types of marketing communications they can expect, and providing a straightforward mechanism to opt out. This aligns with the principles of transparency and informed consent, which are fundamental to data protection laws in Alabama, emphasizing that personal data should only be processed with the individual's clear and affirmative agreement for specific purposes. An approach that relies on implied consent or assumes consent based on the initial transaction is professionally unacceptable. This failure to obtain explicit consent for a new purpose violates the core tenets of data privacy, potentially leading to regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Similarly, proceeding with marketing without any attempt to reconsent, even if the data was collected legally for another purpose, disregards the individual's right to control how their personal information is used for marketing. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the spirit and letter of Alabama's data protection regulations. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes data subject rights and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the specific data being used and its original collection purpose. 2. Determining if the proposed secondary use, marketing, falls within the scope of the original consent. 3. If not, assessing the legal requirements for obtaining new consent under Alabama law, focusing on clarity, specificity, and voluntariness. 4. Implementing robust consent management processes that allow individuals to easily grant, review, and withdraw consent. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating data processing practices to ensure ongoing compliance with evolving privacy landscapes. Question 18. Performance analysis shows that an Alabama resident purchased a defective electronic device online from a seller based in California. The seller's website is accessible globally and does not specifically target Alabama consumers, but the Alabama resident found the website through a general online search. The seller's terms of service include a forum selection clause designating California courts as the exclusive venue for any disputes. Considering Alabama e-commerce law, what is the most appropriate approach for the Alabama resident to determine if they can pursue a legal claim against the California seller in an Alabama court? Option A. Analyze whether the California seller has established sufficient minimum contacts with Alabama, such as purposeful availment of the privilege of conducting business in Alabama, to justify Alabama courts exercising personal jurisdiction over the seller. Consistent with due process, Option B. Assume that because the seller is located in California and the transaction occurred online, Alabama courts lack jurisdiction, and the dispute must be resolved in California. Option C. Conclude that the forum selection clause in the seller's terms of service is binding, requiring the Alabama resident to file any lawsuit exclusively in California courts, regardless of other jurisdictional factors. Option D. Rely solely on the fact that the purchase was made by an Alabama resident, which automatically grants Alabama courts jurisdiction over any out-of-state seller involved in the transaction. Correct answer is A. Analyze whether the California seller has established sufficient minimum contacts with Alabama, such as purposeful availment of the privilege of conducting business in Alabama, to justify Alabama courts exercising personal jurisdiction over the seller, consistent with due process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in e-commerce, where the digital nature of transactions blurs geographical lines, making it difficult to determine which state's laws apply when a consumer in Alabama purchases goods from a seller located in another state. The professional challenge lies in correctly identifying the applicable jurisdiction to ensure compliance with Alabama's consumer protection laws and to avoid potential legal disputes or regulatory penalties. Misinterpreting jurisdiction can lead to significant financial and reputational damage. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough analysis of Alabama's long-arm statute and relevant case law concerning personal jurisdiction over out-of-state defendants in consumer disputes. This approach requires determining if the seller has sufficient minimum contacts with Alabama, such as purposefully availing themselves of the privilege of conducting business in the state, such that exercising jurisdiction would not offend traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. For instance, if the seller actively markets to Alabama consumers, has a significant volume of sales to Alabama residents, or offers services specifically tailored to the Alabama market, Alabama courts may assert jurisdiction. This aligns with the principles of due process and ensures that consumers have a forum to seek redress within their own state when their rights have been violated by businesses targeting them. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that jurisdiction is automatically established simply because a consumer in Alabama made a purchase. This ignores the constitutional requirement of minimum contacts and purposeful availment, which are crucial for establishing personal jurisdiction. Another incorrect approach is to defer to the seller's stated terms of service regarding jurisdiction without independent legal review, especially if those terms attempt to unilaterally dictate an inconvenient or unfair forum for Alabama consumers. This could be seen as an attempt to evade Alabama's consumer protection laws. Finally, assuming that because the seller is located outside of Alabama, Alabama courts have no jurisdiction is also incorrect. Alabama's long-arm statute is designed to extend jurisdiction to the limits of due process, allowing Alabama courts to hear cases against out-of-state defendants who have sufficient connections to the state. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such jurisdictional questions should adopt a systematic decision-making framework. First, identify the governing law. In this case, Alabama e-commerce and consumer protection laws. Second, research Alabama's long-arm statute and relevant case precedents on personal jurisdiction in consumer transactions. Third, analyze the seller's contacts with Alabama, focusing on purposeful availment and the foreseeability of being hailed into an Alabama court. Fourth, consider the fairness and reasonableness of exercising jurisdiction. If these steps indicate sufficient contacts and fairness, then Alabama jurisdiction is likely appropriate. If not, further investigation into other potential jurisdictions may be necessary. Question 19. System analysis indicates a growing e-commerce business operating in Alabama is selling downloadable software. The business is experiencing an increase in return requests for this software, with some customers claiming dissatisfaction after having downloaded and used the product for an extended period. Considering Alabama's e-commerce landscape, what is the most professionally sound approach for the business to manage refund and return policies for these digital goods? Option A. Develop a clear policy stating that refunds are generally not provided for downloaded software once accessed, but offering full refunds or exchanges for any software found to be defective or significantly misrepresented within 14 days of purchase. Option B. Implement a vague return policy that allows customer service representatives to decide on refunds on a case-by-case basis, without specific criteria. Option C. Offer full refunds for any downloaded software upon customer request, without any conditions or time limits, to maximize customer satisfaction. Option D. Refuse all refund requests for downloaded software, regardless of the reason, to prevent potential abuse and maintain consistent policy. The correct answer is A. Develop a clear policy stating that refunds are generally not provided for downloaded software once accessed, but offering full refunds or exchanges for any software found to be defective or significantly misrepresented within 14 days of purchase. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in e-commerce, balancing customer satisfaction with business operational reality, particularly when dealing with returns for digital goods. The professional challenge lies in interpreting Alabama's e-commerce regulations, which may not explicitly detail every nuance of digital product returns, and applying them ethically and effectively. A business must ensure its policies are compliant, transparent, and fair to consumers, while also protecting itself from potential abuse. The ambiguity surrounding consumable digital goods requires careful consideration of both consumer protection laws and the nature of the product itself. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly defining the return policy for digital goods, distinguishing between products that are inherently consumable and those that are not, and providing a reasonable window for returns based on the product's nature and potential for misuse. For digital goods that are immediately accessible and cannot be returned, in a physical sense, the policy should focus on issues like product defects, non-delivery, or significant misrepresentation, offering a refund or exchange for defective or misrepresented digital products within a defined, reasonable timeframe e.g. 7-14 days from purchase, aligns with general consumer protection principles and demonstrates good faith. This approach acknowledges the unique characteristics of digital products while upholding consumer rights under Alabama law, which generally favors transparency and remedies for faulty goods. Incorrect approach is analysis. Refusing all returns for digital goods, regardless of defect or misrepresentation, is professionally unacceptable. This approach fails to acknowledge that Alabama consumer protection laws, while not always specific to digital goods, imply a right to a remedy for goods that are not as described or are faulty. Such a blanket refusal could be seen as a violation of implied warranties or deceptive trade practices. Offering refunds for all digital goods without any conditions or time limits, even for products that have been fully consumed or used, is also professionally unsound. While customer-friendly, this approach can lead to significant financial losses and potential abuse by customers seeking to obtain goods for free. It does not reflect a responsible business practice and may not be legally mandated under Alabama law for all digital products. Implementing a return policy that is vague and inconsistently applied creates confusion and can lead to disputes. If the policy for digital goods is not clearly communicated at the point of sale and is subject to arbitrary interpretation by customer service, it can be perceived as unfair and potentially violate disclosure requirements under Alabama's consumer protection statutes. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes clarity, compliance, and fairness. This involves 1. Understanding the specific nature of the digital product and its potential for consumption or duplication. 2. Researching relevant Alabama consumer protection laws, including those pertaining to deceptive trade practices and implied warranties, and applying them analogously to digital goods where specific regulations are absent. 3. Developing a clear, concise, and easily accessible return policy that outlines conditions for returns, refund eligibility, and timeframes, particularly addressing issues like defects, non-delivery, and misrepresentation. 4. Communicating this policy transparently to customers before purchase. 5. Establishing a fair process for evaluating return requests, distinguishing between legitimate issues and potential abuse. 6. Seeking legal counsel if significant ambiguity exists regarding the application of Alabama law to specific digital product return scenarios. Question 20. The performance metrics show a significant increase in customer complaints regarding advertised prices for a new subscription service offered by an Alabama-based e-commerce company. The service is advertised at a low monthly rate of $19.99. However, upon reaching the checkout page, customers discover a mandatory $50 setup fee and an annual service charge of $75, which were not prominently displayed in the initial advertisement. The company's marketing team argues that the $19.99 is the core price and the additional fees are standard. If the company's total revenue from this service in the last quarter was $500,000 and the setup fees and annual service charges accounted for 30% of this revenue, what is the total amount of revenue generated from these additional fees? Option A, $150,000. Option B, $250,000. Option C, $350,000. Option D, $199,900. Correct answer is A, $150,000. Explanation. The performance metrics show a significant increase in customer complaints related to misleading pricing on online advertisements. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing aggressive marketing strategies with the legal obligations under Alabama's Unfair Trade Practices Act. The core challenge lies in accurately representing pricing to avoid deceiving consumers, which can lead to substantial penalties and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to interpret advertising regulations and apply them to dynamic online pricing models. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of all advertised prices against the actual cost to the consumer, including all mandatory fees and taxes, before the advertisement is published. This includes calculating the total cost of ownership or subscription over a specified period, as advertised. For example, if a service is advertised at a low monthly rate, but significant setup fees or annual commitments are not clearly and conspicuously disclosed, it constitutes a deceptive practice. The Alabama Unfair Trade Practices Act, particularly concerning deceptive advertising, mandates that advertisements must not be misleading or likely to deceive a reasonable consumer. This proactive verification ensures compliance by confirming that the advertised price accurately reflects the total financial obligation. An approach that focuses solely on the advertised base price, without accounting for mandatory additional fees or taxes, is professionally unacceptable. This failure to disclose the full cost is a direct violation of the principle of clear and conspicuous advertising, which is central to preventing deceptive practices under Alabama law. Such an approach creates a misleading impression of the true cost, thereby deceiving consumers. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to rely on a disclaimer buried in the terms and conditions that is not easily visible or understandable to the average consumer at the point of sale. While disclaimers can be used, they must be prominent and directly related to the advertised offer to be effective in mitigating deception. A hidden disclaimer does not cure the initial misleading advertisement. Finally, an approach that assumes bait-and-switch tactics are acceptable as long as the advertised product is technically available, even if the intent is to steer customers to more expensive options, is also professionally unacceptable. Alabama law prohibits practices that are likely to mislead consumers, and bait-and-switch falls squarely within this prohibition. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes consumer protection and legal compliance. This involves 1. Understanding the specific requirements of Alabama's Unfair Trade Practices Act regarding advertising. 2. Conducting a total cost analysis for all advertised pricing, including all mandatory fees and taxes. 3. Ensuring that all material terms and conditions are clearly and conspicuously disclosed at the point of advertisement. And 4. Regularly auditing advertising practices to ensure ongoing compliance and to address any emerging deceptive trends.